In the relentless march of time, humanity has always sought solace amidst the chaos of existence. We have pondered the mysteries of life, sought the elusive elixir of happiness, and grappled with the weight of our own emotions. Through the annals of history, one ancient philosophy has stood the test of time as a beacon of wisdom and resilience: Stoicism. Imagine, if you will, a serene garden in ancient Athens, where the sage Epictetus imparted his timeless wisdom to eager disciples. Born into slavery, Epictetus rose above his circumstances to become one of the most revered Stoic philosophers of antiquity. His teachings resonate with profound simplicity, guiding us to find joy in the present moment, despite the tumultuous currents of life. Stoicism, at its core, is not merely a philosophical doctrine but a way of life, a path to inner tranquility and enduring happiness. It teaches us to embrace the immutable nature of the universe, to accept what we cannot change, and to cultivate virtue in the face of adversity. In the words of the Stoic Emperor Marcus Aurelius, the happiness of your life depends upon the quality of your thoughts. Central to the Stoic ethos is the concept of eudaimonia, often translated as flourishing or fulfillment of one's potential. It is not a fleeting emotion but a state of being rooted in wisdom, courage, temperance, and justice, the four cardinal virtues espoused by Stoic philosophy. These virtues serve as guiding stars, illuminating our path through the dark labyrinth of existence. To achieve true happiness, we must first master the art of self-mastery, a journey fraught with obstacles and temptations. The Stoics likened the human soul to a citadel besieged by external forces, urging us to fortify our defenses through disciplined practice and unwavering resolve. As the Stoic philosopher Seneca declared, we suffer more often in imagination than in reality. One of the most potent tools in the Stoic arsenal is the practice of negative visualization, a technique designed to inoculate the mind against the sting of misfortune. By contemplating the loss of our most cherished possessions or the fleeting nature of life itself, we cultivate gratitude for the precious gifts we often take for granted. As the Roman Stoic philosopher Epictetus admonished, he is a wise man who does not grieve for the things which he has not, but rejoices for those which he has. In the crucible of adversity, Stoicism offers us a steadfast anchor amidst the tempestuous seas of fate. Consider the legendary tale of the Stoic philosopher Cato the Younger, who defied the tyranny of Julius Caesar with unyielding courage and moral integrity. In the face of almost certain death, Cato chose to take his own life rather than live under the yoke of oppression, a testament to the indomitable spirit of Stoic virtue. But Stoicism is not merely a philosophy of resignation or passive acceptance, it is a call to action, a summons to embrace our agency and shape our destiny. The Stoic Emperor Marcus Aurelius exemplified this ethos, ruling the vast Roman Empire with wisdom and benevolence while grappling with the trials of war and political intrigue. His Meditations, a timeless masterpiece of Stoic philosophy, serves as a beacon of inspiration for generations to come. In the crucible of leadership, Stoicism offers invaluable insights into the nature of power and the responsibilities it entails. Effective leaders are not swayed by the capricious winds of fortune but anchored in the bedrock of moral virtue. They lead by example, inspiring others to greatness through their words and deeds, and remain steadfast in the face of adversity. As the Stoic philosopher Epictetus observed, it is not events that disturb people, it is their judgments concerning them. In the modern world, Stoicism continues to exert a profound influence on the hearts and minds of countless individuals seeking meaning amidst the chaos of existence. From Silicon Valley entrepreneurs to elite athletes, Stoicism offers a timeless blueprint for success, a roadmap to inner peace and fulfillment in an age of unprecedented turmoil and uncertainty. In conclusion, Stoicism beckons us to embrace the present moment with courage and equanimity, to cultivate virtue amidst the storms of life, and to find joy in the pursuit of excellence. As the Stoic philosopher Seneca proclaimed, life is long if you know how to use it. Let us heed the wisdom of the ancients, and embark upon this noble journey with fortitude and grace. For in the crucible of adversity, we discover the true essence of our humanity, and the boundless depths of our potential. In the tapestry of human existence, amidst the ebbs and flows of time, there exists a philosophy that has weathered the storms of centuries, offering solace and guidance to those who seek it. Stoicism, born in the crucible of ancient Greece and refined through the annals of history, is not merely a relic of the past but a timeless beacon of wisdom, a path to inner tranquility and enduring happiness. At the heart of Stoicism lies the concept of eudaimonia, a state of flourishing that transcends fleeting pleasures and external circumstances. It is a state of being characterized by the cultivation of virtue and the pursuit of excellence, rooted in the wisdom of the Stoic sages who walked before us. To understand Stoicism is to delve into the depths of human nature and the nature of the universe itself. It is to embrace the inherent interconnectedness of all things, to recognize our place within the grand tapestry of existence and to accept the immutable laws that govern the cosmos. One of the key tenets of Stoicism is the distinction between what is within our control and what lies beyond it. This fundamental principle, articulated by the Stoic philosopher Epictetus, forms the cornerstone of Stoic ethics. By focusing our attention on the things we can change, our thoughts, actions, and attitudes, we free ourselves from the tyranny of external forces and cultivate inner resilience. Consider the story of Zeno of Citium, the founder of Stoicism, who was inspired to seek wisdom after witnessing a shipwreck in Athens. Faced with the fragility of human life and the impermanence of worldly possessions, Zeno embarked upon a journey of self-discovery, ultimately finding solace in the teachings of the Stoic philosophers who guided him. In the crucible of adversity, Stoicism offers us a steadfast anchor amidst the tempestuous seas of fate. Take, for example, the life of the Stoic emperor Marcus Aurelius, who ruled over the vast Roman Empire during a time of turmoil and strife. Despite the weight of his imperial responsibilities, Marcus Aurelius remained steadfast in his commitment to Stoic virtue, finding solace in the wisdom of the Stoic sages and the tranquility of his own inner citadel. But Stoicism is not merely a philosophy of resignation or passive acceptance, it is a call to action, a summons to embrace our agency and shape our destiny. The Stoic philosopher Seneca, in his letters to Lucilius, exhorts us to seize the fleeting moments of life with courage and determination, reminding us that life is long if you know how to use it. In the realm of leadership, Stoicism offers invaluable insights into the nature of power and the responsibilities it entails. Effective leaders, grounded in Stoic virtue, lead by example, inspiring others to greatness through their words and deeds. They remain steadfast in the face of adversity, guided by the principles of wisdom, courage, temperance, and justice, the four cardinal virtues espoused by Stoic philosophy. In the modern world, Stoicism continues to exert a profound influence on the hearts and minds of countless individuals seeking meaning amidst the chaos of existence. From business leaders to athletes, Stoicism offers a timeless blueprint for success, a roadmap to inner peace and fulfillment in an age of unprecedented turmoil and uncertainty. In conclusion, Stoicism beckons us to embrace the present moment with courage and equanimity, to cultivate virtue amidst the storms of life, and to find joy in the pursuit of excellence. As the Stoic philosopher Epictetus admonished, he is a wise man who does not grieve for the things which he has not, but rejoices for those which he has. Let us heed the wisdom of the ancients, and embark upon this noble journey with fortitude and grace. For in the crucible of adversity, we discover the true essence of our humanity, and the boundless depths of our potential. In the turbulent waters of the modern world, where the currents of chaos and uncertainty threaten to engulf us, Stoicism emerges as a steadfast beacon of wisdom, a timeless guide to navigating the stormy seas of life with courage and equanimity. Drawing upon ancient wisdom and contemporary insights, let us embark upon a deep dive into Stoic principles translated into actionable steps for those seeking a guide to happiness in 2024. 1. Mindfulness and present moment awareness. In an age of constant distraction and information overload, cultivating mindfulness and present moment awareness is more crucial than ever. Stoicism teaches us to anchor ourselves in the here and now, to embrace each moment with clarity and intention. By practicing mindfulness meditation and daily reflection, we can cultivate a deeper sense of inner peace and tranquility amidst the chaos of modern life. 2. Emotional resilience and Stoic virtue. Stoicism invites us to cultivate emotional resilience by embracing the cardinal virtues of wisdom, courage, temperance, and justice. In the face of adversity, we can draw upon the wisdom of Stoic philosophers such as Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius, who remind us that true happiness lies not in the absence of suffering, but in our response to it. By embodying Stoic virtue in our daily lives, we can navigate the ups and downs of existence with grace and fortitude. 3. Practicing negative visualization. The practice of negative visualization, a cornerstone of Stoic philosophy, offers a powerful antidote to the hedonic treadmill of modern consumer culture. By contemplating the impermanence of all things and envisioning the loss of our most cherished possessions, we cultivate gratitude for the present moment and a deeper appreciation for the blessings in our lives. This practice fosters resilience in the face of adversity and helps us cultivate a sense of perspective amidst life's challenges. 4. Focus on what is within our control. In a world rife with uncertainty, Stoicism teaches us to focus our attention on what is within our control and let go of that which is beyond it. By adopting a proactive mindset and taking responsibility for our thoughts, actions, and attitudes, we empower ourselves to shape our destiny and navigate life's complexities with agency and purpose. This principle, articulated by the Stoic philosopher Epictetus, forms the cornerstone of Stoic ethics and offers a potent antidote to the sense of helplessness and despair that can accompany modern living. 5. Embracing impermanence and acceptance. Stoicism invites us to embrace the impermanence of all things and cultivate acceptance of life's inherent unpredictability. By recognizing the transitory nature of pleasure and pain, success and failure, we can cultivate a sense of equanimity and serenity amidst life's vicissitudes. This practice fosters resilience in the face of adversity and enables us to navigate life's uncertainties with grace and acceptance. 6. Community and connection. In an increasingly fragmented and isolated world, Stoicism emphasizes the importance of community and connection. By cultivating meaningful relationships and fostering a sense of belonging, we can find solace and support amidst life's challenges. Stoic communities, both online and offline, offer a rich tapestry of shared wisdom and mutual support, enabling us to navigate the complexities of modern life with courage and resilience. In conclusion, Stoicism offers a timeless blueprint for happiness and fulfillment in an age of unprecedented change and uncertainty. By embracing Stoic principles and translating them into actionable steps, we can navigate life's challenges with courage, resilience, and grace. As the Stoic philosopher Seneca once said, "Life is long if you know how to use it." Let us heed the wisdom of the ancients and embark upon this noble journey with fortitude and grace, forging our own path to happiness and fulfillment in 2024 and beyond. Dear viewers, in the vast expanse of the digital realm, amidst the cacophony of voices clamoring for attention, I invite you to pause, to take a moment of respite amidst the chaos, and embark upon a journey of self-discovery and transformation. In the crucible of modern life, where the pace of existence seems to accelerate with each passing day, it is all too easy to lose sight of what truly matters, to become ensnared in the endless pursuit of fleeting pleasures and external validations. But amidst the noise and distraction, there exists a timeless philosophy, a beacon of wisdom and resilience, that offers solace and guidance to those who seek it. That philosophy is Stoicism. Stoicism is not merely an abstract doctrine confined to dusty tomes and ivory towers, it is a way of life, a path to inner tranquility and enduring happiness. It teaches us to embrace the present moment with courage and equanimity, to cultivate virtue amidst the storms of life, and to find joy in the pursuit of excellence. In the tapestry of human existence, Stoicism offers us a roadmap, a blueprint for navigating the complexities of modern living with grace and resilience. By embracing Stoic principles and translating them into actionable steps, we can cultivate emotional resilience, foster meaningful connections, and find solace amidst the chaos of existence. So I invite you, dear viewers, to join me on this journey, a journey of self-discovery, growth, and transformation. Together, let us explore the depths of Stoic wisdom, and forge our own path to happiness and fulfillment in 2024 and beyond. If you found this exploration of Stoic wisdom insightful and inspiring, I encourage you to show your support by liking this video and subscribing to our channel. By doing so, you'll stay updated on future content and join a community of like-minded individuals on the path to self-discovery and growth. Your support means the world to us, and together, we can continue to explore the depths of Stoic philosophy and its timeless relevance in our modern lives. So don't hesitate, hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, and join us on this journey of self-discovery and transformation. Thank you for your support.